using HTML, CSS, maybe some JavaScript without ever touching or learning Objective-C. Works on all devices. It would work on an Android phone. Windows mobile phone wouldn't look like it belongs on either of those devices, but it would certainly still work.
Speed up development time.
Speed of development. Sort of 15 minutes later, we're done with the course's website. So we don't even have to look at a line of Objective-C, and it will be more complex.
Maintenance.
What's that?
Maintenance of different. You don't have to be changing like every single native app you have.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot easier to update because even though I'm using this local web server right now, if you imagine just uploading that to the real internet and some commercial web host, I can just upload my code in one central place and no one has to update their native software. They don't have to go into the App Store to run an update. It's just anytime they visit my page, it's just going to be the way I intend it. So that's a lot of arguments in favor, but we are paying some prices. There's the aesthetic blips that are happening, whether we use CSS or even a little bit of JavaScript. There is going to be some latency. In fact, one of the biggest complaints against making apps web-based is that they just tend to feel slower. If you're a Facebook user, up until a year or more ago, a lot of the Facebook application, even though it looked like a native application, was using embedded Safari windows inside of it and grabbing content from Facebook's web servers, which is nice because they're already very good at serving up web content, and all they had to do was implement a minimum amount of code to wrap those web pages. But a lot of people, maybe you among them, griped about the speed of the application. And over the past year or more, it's gotten much faster because there's a lot more native code. So just some of the trade-offs to consider. Yeah?
No hardware user access like the apps normally.
So that's another good one, too. And we'll come back to that later in the semester. But there's some really cool hardware underneath the hood in these iOS devices, right? You have things like a compass, you have an accelerometer, a gyroscope, and other hardware still. And some of that hardware is just not accessible to JavaScript or to a web browser. That's slowly beginning to change. You can access more and more via JavaScript, and we'll see a little bit of that tonight. But there are some things that are beyond your reach. And that's a big one, too. The fact that you can put a native app in the App Store, whether for free or for some number of cents or dollars, is pretty compelling because it's hard to convince anyone to buy or pay for access to a website in the same way that they do something through the App Store. Yeah?
Could you put this into a frame, maybe? And then when you click on it, it wouldn't change the URL.
Good question. Could you put the mobile website into a frame, an iframe, or an actual HTML frame so that it's the URL of the innermost frame that's changing? Yes, you could. The only thing is the URL at the top will never change, and maybe that's OK, but then you'll lose the ability to deep link to specific pages. But a good workaround. All right, so let's just take a quick look at how we implemented this jQuery mobile version. We won't spend much time on it. You'll be welcome to use it for the first project, and its documentation online is ample. But let's take a look at the underlying source code for that third and final incarnation of the super simple course website. Notice at the top, we've added another CSS file. This one happens to belong to jQuery mobile itself, so I just read that off from the documentation. We've got our meta tag just like before. I've got a script tag, this time importing jQuery. And if unfamiliar with jQuery, or if unfamiliar with JavaScript itself, we'll come back to that shortly tonight, and then one other script tag referencing this jQuery mobile site. And then if we scroll down below, you'll actually see that I'm making use of a pretty handy HTML5 feature. So what attributes are jumping out at you at perhaps being completely new? Yeah, so data-role. That's not an actual valid HTML attribute. And what else? Data-theme. That's pushing it further. That, too, is not a standard attribute in HTML5, but this is actually a feature of HTML5. If you prefix an attribute with data hyphen, you can create any attributes you want. And they will not be flagged as invalid by a validator. The browsers won't choke on them. So this is a way of storing metadata often inside of your web page in a way that's going to be very accessible via something like JavaScript, but without resorting to hacks and coming up with your own tags and your own attributes, which the world did do for some time with HTML4 and XHTML, which often made browsers unhappy. So this is like a nice way of including metadata alongside your own data. But as for what jQuery mobile is doing, well, why did I put data role? Why did I put data theme? I just read the documentation for jQuery mobile. And jQuery mobile essentially told me to make one div for each of the screens that I want to exist in that faux application, the first one being the home page, the next one being the lectures page, the third one being the lecture 0 page. So I just have a div here, including some links. And if we keep scrolling down further, you'll see another bunch of content, another page, so to speak, for lectures. And so in short, the folks at jQuery Mobile decided to leverage these arbitrary data attributes to create their own markup language, still using valid HTML5. And what do you think their JavaScript file does upon being loaded into this page, for those familiar already with some JavaScript? How does jQuery Mobile turn this HTML into the user interface we saw as this? What would you do if you were a library written in some language called JavaScript that's being loaded into the web page at the top, and you know that lying ahead of you is markup that looks like this? What does jQuery Mobile presumably do to turn this into that? So if I were jQuery Mobile, I would probably search through the web page somehow, looking for all divs that have what associated with them? A data role of page. Not asking you how to do this, just high level conceptually. So if I were jQuery Mobile, I'd probably do some kind of search of the whole web page, looking for divs that have a data role of quote unquote page. And then I'm going to do something aesthetically, probably involving some CSS, to create that rectangle that looks like a screen of a native application. And I'm going to do that again and again and again for each of the pages that are defined in here. And meanwhile, anytime I encounter a div who has a data role of header, for instance, well, that's when I'm going to deploy some of that nice gradient with the blue shading. And I don't know how I'm going to do that, but at least at a high level, that's all this library is doing. And so what's nice about jQuery Mobile is that you don't even need to know JavaScript to use it. You need to just follow their directions and mark up your own content using this div approach with these data attributes. Sencha Touch, by contrast, one of the other frameworks I mentioned, very much the opposite. You instead write a whole lot of JavaScript code to create your user interface. jQuery Mobile is meant to be much more lightweight and much simpler. Yeah? So it's a good question. Let me summarize as, doesn't this get confusing, or doesn't this paint you into a corner if things change over time, or you just have to remember all of the various aspects of some fairly proprietary, if open source, design? Short answer, yes. And that's sort of one of the trade-offs you make, whether or not you implement something entirely on your own, using pure raw HTML, your own CSS, your own JavaScript code, or you try to save time and stand on the shoulders of other people who hopefully have a good community behind them, who have good documentation behind them, to save yourself the hour, the 10 hours, the 100 hours that it would otherwise take just to kind of come up with this overarching framework. So short answer, yes. It's definitely a downside, but if it means you can finish the project in 10% of the amount of time, that too could be compelling. You could implement it 10 times over the next few years as things change. But definitely a challenge overall. Other questions? Yeah?
It looks a little bit like you define all the pages on one HTML page actually from this example.
Indeed.
That's something that's always came with jQuery Mobile?
With jQuery Mobile, at least with this particular user interface that I've chosen, yes. All of the HTML and all of the pages are in one arguably big HTML file. And the motivation for that is largely so that you can do the seamless transitions with as little latency as possible. If you instead had to fetch more content with every transition, you might introduce a second, maybe even 2 seconds or more of delay, and that would make it feel even less like a native app. You can do that, and you can tell the browser to go fetch those pages dynamically, which frankly is necessary if you had more than 3 pages. Maybe you had 3,000. You just wouldn't want to send a 10 megabyte file down. But that too is a trade-off, and you have to decide where the line is between convenience and size. Good question. All right, so let's pluck off a few smaller details, smaller features of HTML5 that we can leverage here in order to make pages all the more mobile friendly. So if I switch back to this screen here and move us ahead to here. There we go. So here's a new one, another meta tag. So Apple has made ample use of this meta tag, which again today some of you have probably never used, or you've used it for some search engine optimizations. So here is one called Apple Mobile Web App Capable. If its content is quote unquote yes, what do you think this means? It is indeed mobile web app capable. What does that actually translate into? So most iPhone users don't actually do this, but you might know that if you're visiting a web page in Safari and you decide, wow, I really like this website, I want to return to it in the future, you can either, one, bookmark it, which is very 1990s style, or what else can you do if you've ever actually done this? What's that? So you can actually add it to the home screen. So if I go to, let's go back to my iOS simulator, which again we'll have you download in a week or two's time. And I go back to my directory of code. Let me go back, and let me go into tonight's. Well, that would spoil the surprise of what I see here. Yes? Fix that later. So if I go into my HTML5 page, folder, and scroll down here, and I go to, let's say, app.html. This is a super simple app. I spent like 5 seconds making it. All it has is an image tag. But I really like this image, and so I want to not only bookmark it, I actually want to have an icon on my home screen that forever shows this icon complete with the glistening Apple sparkles that makes it look like a very three-dimensional button. But how do you do that? Well, let me go to this same page in my browser, just so I can zoom in on it over here. And you'll see the same boring website, but underneath the hood in the source, notice that I've included this. And I've also jumped the gun and also included this, which, aptly named, makes the Apple Mobile Web App status bar style, quote unquote, black. So instead of getting the default blue or some other color, I just want the status bar at the top of my Safari instance to be black in this case. So if I go to my mobile browser and click on this icon here, which any iPhone user has, notice here in the middle, I have an icon, Add to Home Screen. If I did not have that mobile-friendly feature enabled, we couldn't do this. I'm going to go ahead and add this to my home screen. It's called Harvard App. It's pulling that from the title tag of the web page. And now it's here on my desktop. And now I have an icon on my desktop. So I can now forever get back to this app by clicking this. And notice the status bar is black. And notice, you can't quite see my fingers doing this, but if I click on the screen or touch the screen and try to drag down, what is absent? Yeah, so the address bar, the URL bar that's usually there. But this is Safari. But it's mimicking the idea of a native application by not revealing to me that it's Safari. But the only reason it did that was because in my HTML, I proactively, if verbosely, told the browser that it is mobile web app capable. So that's all that meta tag does. And there's a bunch of others that do similar tweaks to your interface. The status bar style we just saw. The Apple Touch icon can also be defined here. So if you define Apple Touch icon to be some ping, and there's actual pixel specifications you can read up online or just match the one that we included here, that's how you can specify what icon shows up. So it's not the default fav icon or whatever black and white icons there by default. You can do a pre-composed one. So if you really don't like Apple's sort of three-dimensional glistening of your icons, which they add for you to your icon, you can say, I have a pre-composed ping, which means I'm really good at Photoshop. I made the three-dimensional button myself. Don't add additional gloss to it. So there's that feature as well. And then startup image. If you have a really crappy website that takes a really long time to load, you can show the user an image as it's loading up. And that isn't necessarily a bad website. It might just be one that has to request a whole lot of data. If Gmail, frankly, needs to request a lot of data so that you can begin interacting with your folders and labels and your inbox. So Gmail, for instance, might have an icon implemented in this fashion here. So any questions on those more aesthetic tweaks that you can apply? All right, so where does that leave us? In order to get that slightly more dynamic interface, even though it was imperfect with jQuery Mobile, we added this last line of yellow text in a language called JavaScript. Some of you, many of you might not even know JavaScript, or at least the aspects of it that we're going to leverage for mobile. But let's pause here, take a look at the course itself before diving back into actual development. So this is building mobile applications. What does that actually mean? The prerequisites for the class as you might have seen in the course catalog, are simply these: prior programming experience in any object-oriented language. So that could be something like Java, C++, C#, or any number of other languages. But the goal is to have students in this course have comfort